On the morning of October 28, 1922, columns of men in black shirts began converging on Rome from all directions. They came from the north, from Milan and Turin and Bologna, traveling by train, by truck, by foot. They came from the south, from Naples and the Mezzogiorno, armed with rifles and clubs and the absolute certainty that they were making history. They came from the towns and villages of the Italian countryside, farmers and shopkeepers and war veterans who had been promised that Italy would be great again. By some estimates, 30,000 men were marching on the Italian capital. By other estimates, the number was closer to 16,000. The exact figure mattered less than the spectacle, thousands of armed men converging on Rome to seize power. They called themselves fascists, from the Italian word fascio, meaning bundle. A reference to the fasces of ancient Rome, the bundle of rods and an axe that symbolized the authority of Roman magistrates. Their leader was a 40-year-old former socialist named Benito Mussolini, who had founded the fascist movement 3 years earlier and had spent those years building an organization dedicated to violence, nationalism, and the destruction of liberal democracy. The march on Rome was both less and more than it appeared. Less because it was not truly a military operation. The marchers were poorly armed, poorly organized, and would have been no match for the Italian army if the government had chosen to resist. The weather was terrible. Cold rain soaked the Blackshirts as they trudged toward the capital. Many were hungry, exhausted, and would have fled at the first sign of serious opposition. More because the government did not choose to resist. Prime Minister Luigi Facta, a weak figure in a weak government, prepared a decree declaring martial law and ordering the army to disperse the marchers. But King Victor Emmanuel III refused to sign it. The reasons for his refusal remain debated: fear of civil war, sympathy with the fascists, pressure from the military, a calculation that Mussolini could be controlled. Whatever his motives, the king's refusal to authorize resistance made the march on Rome a success before a shot was fired. On October 29th, the king summoned Mussolini to Rome to form a government. Mussolini, who had prudently remained in Milan in case the march failed, boarded a sleeping car for the overnight journey to the capital. He arrived on the morning of October 30th wearing his signature black shirt under his coat. "Majesty," he reportedly said to the king, "I come from the battlefield." Fortunately bloodless. It was a lie, of course. Fascist squads had killed hundreds of opponents in the years leading up to the march. The violence would only intensify once Mussolini was in power. But the lie captured something essential about fascism. It presented itself as a movement of strength and vitality, sweeping away the weak and corrupt politicians of the old order. The reality of murder and intimidation was cloaked in the rhetoric of national renewal. Mussolini was 39 years old when he became Prime Minister of Italy. He was the first of the post-war dictators, the first to demonstrate that democracy could be overthrown not just by revolution from below, but by a combination of violence, political maneuvering, and the complicity of traditional elites. His example would be studied and imitated across Europe and beyond. Within a decade, dictators would rule half the continent. This is the story of how democracy retreated across Europe and Asia in the years after the First World War. Of how fascism, communism, and military authoritarianism rose to power in country after country. Of how the hopes of 1918, that the war had been fought to make the world safe for democracy, were betrayed by the reality of 1938 when dictatorships stretched from Portugal to Japan. This is the story of why democracy failed where it did, and how the regimes that replaced it would eventually drag the world into a conflict that would make the First World War seem like a prelude. This is the story of the rise of the dictators. To understand how Mussolini came to power, we must understand the crisis that gripped Italy after the First World War. Italy had entered the war in 1915 on the side of the Allies, lured by promises of territorial gains at Austria-Hungary's expense. The war had cost Italy dearly, over 600,000 dead, 1 million wounded, and the economy strained to the breaking point. When the peace came, Italy received significant territories: the Trentino, the South Tyrol, Trieste, and Istria, but not everything it had been promised. The Treaty of London had promised Italy large portions of the Dalmatian coast, but these went instead to the new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Italian nationalists spoke bitterly of a mutilated victory, of sacrifices unrewarded and promises betrayed. The post-war years brought economic chaos and political instability. Inflation eroded wages. Unemployment soared as soldiers returned to a civilian economy that could not absorb them. Strikes paralyzed the industry. In 1919 and 1920, workers in northern Italy occupied factories and seemed on the verge of revolution. The 2 Red Years, as they came to be called, terrified the middle classes and the landowners who saw in the strikes and occupations the specter of Bolshevism. Into this chaos stepped Benito Mussolini. He was an unlikely savior of the Italian bourgeoisie, a former socialist, a former editor of the Socialist Party newspaper, a man who had been expelled from the party for supporting Italy's entry into the war. But Mussolini was, above all, an opportunist. He sensed that the moment was ripe for a new kind of politics, one that combined nationalism with violence, that rejected both liberal democracy and Marxist socialism, that promised action rather than debate. The fascist movement that Mussolini founded in March 1919 was initially small and ideologically confused. Its program mixed left-wing demands, an 8-hour workday, worker participation in management, land reform, with right-wing nationalism and militarism. What distinguished the fascists was not their ideas but their methods. They organized armed squads, the squadristi, who attacked socialist and trade union offices, beat up opponents, and terrorized the left with systematic violence. The squadristi found eager recruits among demobilized soldiers, particularly the arditi, the elite assault troops who had been trained for trench raids and who found civilian life unbearable. They found patrons among industrialists and landowners who were willing to pay for the destruction of socialist organizations. And they found allies among police and military officers who sympathized with their nationalism and turned a blind eye to their crimes. The violence was extraordinary. Between 1920 and 1922, fascist squads destroyed over 700 socialist and trade union headquarters. They killed hundreds of opponents. They forced socialist mayors to resign at gunpoint. They broke strikes by beating workers. In the Po Valley, squadristi conducted punitive expeditions against socialist strongholds, burning buildings and forcing victims to drink castor oil as a humiliating punishment. The liberal government was paralyzed. It lacked the will to suppress the fascist violence and lacked the political strength to form stable coalitions. Giovanni Giolitti, the veteran politician who had dominated Italian politics before the war, tried to incorporate the fascists into a governing coalition, hoping to tame them through participation. It was a fatal miscalculation. The fascists used their growing respectability to expand their power while continuing their campaign of violence. By 1922, the fascists controlled large areas of northern Italy. Their numbers had grown from a few hundred in 1919 to perhaps 300,000 by the time of the March on Rome. They had seats in parliament, allies among the traditional elites, and a leader who combined revolutionary rhetoric with a willingness to deal with the establishment. The March on Rome was the culmination of this process. Mussolini demanded power, backed by the implicit threat of civil war. The king and the traditional elites decided that it was easier to give him power than to fight him. They believed, as conservatives would believe again and again across Europe, that they could use the fascists to destroy the left and then control them. They were wrong. Once in power, Mussolini moved slowly but inexorably toward dictatorship. Initially, he governed as the head of a coalition that included liberals and conservatives. He maintained the forms of constitutional government. The parliament continued to meet, elections continued to be held, and the king remained as head of state. But behind these forms, fascist power was consolidating. The turning point came in 1924. In April, parliamentary elections were held under a new electoral law that guaranteed 2/3 of the seats to whichever party or coalition won the most votes. The fascists, through a combination of violence and manipulation, won 65% of the vote. But their victory was marred by the kidnapping and murder of Giacomo Matteotti, a socialist deputy who had exposed fascist electoral fraud in a courageous speech to Parliament. Matteotti's murder caused a political crisis. For a moment, it seemed that the regime might fall. Opposition deputies walked out of parliament in what was called the Aventine Secession, hoping to force the king to dismiss Mussolini. But Victor Emmanuel refused to act, and without royal support, the opposition was helpless. Mussolini weathered the crisis and drew the lesson that boldness paid. In January 1925, he gave a speech to Parliament in which he accepted political, moral, and historical responsibility for the violence of the fascist movement, including, by implication, the murder of Mattiatti. "If fascism has been a criminal association," he declared, "I am the chief of this criminal association." It was a remarkable moment. Mussolini was daring his opponents to act, knowing they could not. Over the following months, he dismantled what remained of Italian democracy. Opposition parties were banned, the free press was suppressed, independent trade unions were dissolved, local governments were placed under fascist control. A secret police, the Avra, was created to monitor and suppress dissent. By 1926, Italy was a one-party state. Mussolini was no longer merely prime minister but head of government, a title that placed him above parliament and responsible only to the king. He cultivated the image of Il Duce, the leader, a figure of superhuman energy and wisdom who would restore Italy to the greatness of ancient Rome. The fascist state was, in theory, totalitarian, a word that Mussolini embraced. Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state, he proclaimed. In practice, Italian fascism was less thorough than its rhetoric suggested. The Catholic Church remained powerful, and Mussolini made peace with it through the Lateran Treaty of 1929, which recognized Vatican City as an independent state and established Catholicism as Italy's official religion. The monarchy remained. The industrialists and landowners who had backed fascism retained their property and privileges. The apparatus of repression was brutal but less efficient than in Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia. But the fundamental achievement of Italian fascism was clear. Democracy had been destroyed, and in its place stood a dictatorship that glorified violence, nationalism, and the state. Mussolini had shown that it could be done, that a determined movement, backed by violence and complicit elites, could overthrow democracy and seize total power. His example would be studied carefully in Munich. While Mussolini was consolidating his power in Italy, a very different kind of dictatorship was taking shape in the Soviet Union. Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution, died on January 21, 1924, after a series of strokes that had left him increasingly incapacitated. He was 53 years old, and he had spent the last years of his life watching helplessly as his revolution devoured itself. Lenin had created a one-party state in which all power was concentrated in the Communist Party, and within the party, in a small leadership group. He had used terror against his enemies, real and imagined, through the Cheka, the secret police. He had crushed opposition parties, suppressed dissent, and built the foundations of a totalitarian system. But he had never resolved the question of who would succeed him. In the last months of his active life, Lenin had dictated a testament assessing the leading candidates for success. Of Joseph Stalin, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Lenin wrote, "Comrade Stalin, having become General Secretary, has concentrated unlimited power in his hands, and I am not sure whether he will always be capable of using that power with sufficient caution." In a postscript added shortly afterward, Lenin went further. Stalin is too rude, and this defect becomes intolerable in a general secretary. Therefore, I suggest that the comrades think about a way to remove Stalin from that post. The testament was never made public during Stalin's lifetime. It was read to the Central Committee after Lenin's death, but Stalin's allies prevented it from being circulated. Stalin survived. And over the next 5 years, he systematically destroyed his rivals and made himself the undisputed master of the Soviet Union. Stalin's rise was a masterpiece of political manipulation. As General Secretary, he controlled appointments to party positions throughout the country. He placed his supporters in key posts and removed those loyal to his rivals. He built a machine of patronage and dependence that owed everything to him. His chief rivals were formidable figures. Leon Trotsky was the hero of the Civil War, the organizer of the Red Army, and a brilliant orator and theorist. Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev were old Bolsheviks with revolutionary credentials stretching back decades. Nikolai Bukharin was Lenin's favorite theorist, praised in the Testament as the favorite of the whole party. Any of them might have seemed more likely to succeed Lenin than the quiet, methodical Georgian who ran the party apparatus, but Stalin understood power in ways that his rivals did not. While they debated theory and policy, he accumulated control. He formed alliances, first with Zinoviev and Kamenev against Trotsky, then with Bukharin against Zinoviev and Kamenev against Bukharin. Each alliance lasted until his allies were no longer useful, and then he turned on them with the same ruthlessness he had shown to his enemies. Trotsky was expelled from the party in 1927, exiled from the Soviet Union in 1929, and murdered in Mexico in 1940 by a Soviet agent. Zinoviev and Kamenev would be executed after show trials in 1936. Bukharin would follow in 1938. By the end of the 1930s, virtually all of Lenin's original colleagues would be dead, killed on Stalin's orders. Stalin's consolidation of power coincided with a fundamental transformation of Soviet society. In 1928, he launched the first five-year plan, a crash program of industrialization that would transform the Soviet Union from an agricultural country into an industrial power. The plan was implemented with ruthless speed, factories built, cities constructed, workers driven to meet impossible quotas. The human cost was appalling. Workers labored under brutal conditions. Shortages of food and housing were endemic. Those who fell short of quotas were accused of sabotage and punished. But production increased dramatically. By the early 1930s, the Soviet Union was producing steel, coal, and machinery at rates that amazed foreign observers. Even more devastating was the collectivization of agriculture. Stalin decreed that the peasants must give up their individual farms and join collective farms, kolkhozy, controlled by the state. Those who resisted, and millions did, were labeled kulaks, class enemies, and subjected to dekulakization. Their property was confiscated. They were deported to labor camps in Siberia. Many were simply shot. The result was a catastrophe. Agricultural production collapsed. A famine swept through Ukraine, the Volga region, and Kazakhstan in 1932-1933. Perhaps 5 million people died. Some historians estimate far more. In Ukraine, the famine was intensified by deliberate policies that stripped the peasants of their grain even as they starved. Ukrainians call this the Holodomor, the death by hunger, and consider it a genocide. Stalin denied that the famine was occurring. Foreign journalists who reported on it were discredited or expelled. The Soviet government continued to export grain even as its own people starved, needing the foreign currency to pay for industrial machinery. The famine was hushed up, and for decades the outside world knew little of what had happened. By the mid-1930s, Stalin's power was absolute. He was no longer merely the general secretary, but the vozhd, the leader of godlike authority whose every word was law. His image was everywhere, in schools and factories, in homes. His name was attached to cities, to mountains, to collective farms. He had created a system in which terror and adulation coexisted, in which millions lived in fear of arrest, and millions of others genuinely worshipped him as the architect of a new civilization. The Great Purge of 1936-1938 would take the terror to new heights. Stalin would turn on the Communist Party itself, arresting and executing hundreds of thousands of party members, military officers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens accused of imaginary crimes. The purges would decimate the Soviet military leadership, creating a weakness that Hitler would exploit in 1941, but all of that lay in the future. In the early 1930s, Stalin had achieved what no one had thought possible: the industrialization of Russia in a decade at the cost of millions of lives. The system he had created was brutal, but it was also powerful. The Soviet Union was becoming a force that would shape the 20th century. On the other side of the world, a different kind of authoritarianism was emerging in Japan. Japan in the 1920s was, at least nominally, a constitutional monarchy with a functioning parliament, competing political parties, and a degree of press freedom. The Taisho era 1912–1926 had seen the expansion of voting rights and the growth of democratic politics. But underneath this democratic veneer, powerful forces were working against liberal government. The Japanese military existed outside civilian control. Under the Meiji Constitution, the armed forces reported directly to the emperor, bypassing the cabinet. The Army and Navy ministers had to be serving officers, giving the military a veto over any government. If the services refused to nominate ministers, no cabinet could be formed. This structural arrangement gave the military enormous political power. The 1920s brought economic difficulties that undermined support for party government. The Great Earthquake of 1923 devastated Tokyo and Yokohama, killing over 100,000 people and causing immense economic damage. The banking crisis of 1927 shook confidence in the financial system. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, hit Japan hard, particularly the rural areas where peasants depended on exports of As the economy deteriorated, radical nationalist and militarist ideas gained adherents, particularly among junior officers who came from rural backgrounds and who saw the suffering of their families. They blamed the political parties, the Zaibatsu industrial conglomerates, and the internationalist foreign policy of the 1920s. They believed that Japan's destiny lay in expansion, in creating an empire that would give Japan access to the resources and markets it needed. The army was particularly influenced by these ideas. Many officers had served in the Kwantung Army, the Japanese force stationed in Manchuria to protect Japan's interests there. They saw Manchuria, with its coal, iron, and agricultural land, as the solution to Japan's problem. They advocated seizing it from China, whatever the civilian government might think. On the night of September 18, 1931, officers of the Kwantung Army staged an incident that would change Asian history. They detonated a small explosive charge on the South Manchuria Railway near Mukden, now Shenyang, causing minor damage to the tracks. They blamed the explosion on Chinese saboteurs and used it as a pretext to attack the Chinese garrison in Mukden. The Manchurian Incident, as it came to be known, was an act of insubordination on a massive scale. The Kwantung Army acted without orders from Tokyo. When the civilian government tried to halt the operation, the army simply ignored it. Within months, Japanese forces had conquered all of Manchuria, an area larger than France and Germany combined. The government in Tokyo was presented with a fait accompli. It could disown the army's actions and risk a military coup, or it could accept what had been done and try to manage the consequences. It chose acceptance. Manchuria was reorganized as the puppet state of Manchukuo, with the last king emperor, Puyi, installed as its nominal ruler. Japan had acquired an empire through military insubordination. The Manchurian Incident demonstrated that the Japanese military could act independently of civilian control, and that the civilian government was too weak to stop it. It also demonstrated that the international community was too weak to reverse Japanese aggression. China appealed to the League of Nations, which dispatched a commission of inquiry under Lord Lytton. The Lytton Report, published in 1932, concluded that Japan's actions were unjustified and that Manchukuo was not a genuinely independent state. The League of Nations adopted the Lytton Report and called on Japan to withdraw from Manchuria. Japan refused. In March 1933, Japan announced its withdrawal from the League. The first major challenge to the post-war international order had been met with words, not action. The lesson was not lost on other potential aggressors. Within Japan, the success of the Manchurian adventure strengthened the militarists and weakened the advocates of party government and international cooperation. A wave of political terrorism swept the country. In 1932 alone, the Prime Minister, Inukai Tsuyoshi, was assassinated by naval officers. The Finance Minister, Inao Junsuk, was killed by a right-wing fanatic, and an industrialist, Baron Dan Takumatova, was murdered. The assassins were treated leniently by the courts, their patriotic motives serving as mitigating factors. By the mid-1930s, party government in Japan was effectively over. The military dominated politics, and the militarists within the army dominated the military. Civilian politicians who opposed expansion were silenced or eliminated. Japan was set on a path of imperial conquest that would lead it into conflict with China, Britain, the Netherlands, and eventually the United States. Emperor Hirohito, who had ascended the throne in 1926, presided over this transformation. His role remains controversial. Was he a powerless figurehead, as post-war mythology would claim, or an active participant in Japan's aggression? The evidence suggests something in between, a monarch who was uncomfortable with some of his military's actions, but who never used his considerable authority to stop them, who rubber-stamped decisions for war while maintaining the fiction of divine detachment. The Japanese system was not identical to European fascism, but it shared key features: extreme nationalism, military glorification, contempt for liberal democracy, and a willingness to use violence in pursuit of national goals. Japan would become an ally of Germany and Italy, joining the Axis powers in 1940. The three regimes, whatever their differences, recognized each other as kindred spirits. While Mussolini, Stalin, and the Japanese militarists were consolidating their power, democracy was retreating across much of Europe. Hungary, stripped of two-thirds of its territory by the Treaty of Trianon, had experienced a brief communist revolution in 1919 under Bela Kun. When the communists fell, a white terror followed, targeting Jews, socialists, and anyone associated with the revolution. Admiral Miklos Horthy, a former naval commander in a now landlocked country, became regent in 1920 and would remain in power until 1944. Horthy's Hungary was not fascist in the Italian sense, but it was authoritarian. Political opposition was tolerated within limits. Elections were held, but they were managed to ensure the right results. The regime was intensely nationalistic, dedicated to revising Trianon and recovering Hungary's lost territories. It was also increasingly anti-Semitic, passing Europe's first post-war anti-Semitic legislation in 1920, restricting Jewish access to universities. Poland, recreated after 123 years of partition, struggled with the challenges of building a unified state from territories that had been ruled by Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. Parliamentary government produced weak and unstable coalitions. In May 1926, Marshal Joseph Pilsudski, the hero of Polish independence and the victor of the Polish-Soviet War, staged a coup d'état. He marched on Warsaw with loyal troops, defeated the government forces in 3 days of street fighting that killed over 500 people, and established what he called Sanicja regime, government by cleansing. Pilsudski's Poland was authoritarian, but not totalitarian. Political parties continued to exist, though they were harassed. Parliament continued to meet, though its powers were circumscribed. The press was censored, but not entirely suppressed. Pilsudski ruled as a military strongman until he died in 1935, after which his successors continued the regime in increasingly authoritarian form. Portugal had been a republic since 1910, but parliamentary government had produced chronic instability, 45 governments in 16 years. In 1926, the military seized power. 2 years later, an economics professor named Antonio de Oliveira Salazar became finance minister and quickly made himself indispensable. By 1932, he was prime minister, a position he would hold for 36 years. Salazar's Estado Novo, the new state, was a peculiar form of dictatorship, Catholic, corporatist, anti-communist, but not aggressive or expansionist. Salazar had no interest in military glory or territorial conquest. He wanted order, stability, and the preservation of Portugal's colonial empire. His regime was repressive. The secret police, PIDE monitored dissent, and opponents were imprisoned or exiled. But it was not murderous on the scale of Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia. Spain followed a similar trajectory. The military dictatorship of General Miguel Primo de Rivera, 1923-1930, collapsed, giving way to a republic in 1931. The Spanish Republic was riven by conflicts between left and right, between centralists and regionalists, between Catholics and anti-clericals. Elections swung wildly between coalitions of the left and coalitions of the right. political violence escalated. In 1936, a military uprising against the elected government would trigger a civil war that would last 3 years, kill 500,000 people, and end with the dictatorship of General Francisco Franco. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had emerged from the Russian Empire as democracies, all experienced coups or authoritarian takeovers in the 1930s. So did Austria, where Engelbert Dollfuss established a clerical authoritarian regime in 1933-1934 before being murdered by Nazis, and Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece. By the mid-1930s, the map of Europe showed democracy in retreat everywhere. The Western democracies, Britain, France, the Low Countries, Scandinavia, and Czechoslovakia, were surrounded by dictatorships of the right and left. The authoritarian regimes varied in their ideologies and their methods, but they shared a common contempt for liberal democracy, a belief that strong leadership was needed to overcome national crises, and a willingness to use force against their opponents. Why did democracy fail so widely in interwar Europe? The question has preoccupied historians for decades, and no single answer suffices. But several factors appear again and again across the countries where democracy collapsed. The economic crisis was nearly universal. The First World War had disrupted economies, created debts, and generated expectations that governments could not fulfill. The hyperinflation of the early 1920s destroyed savings in Germany and Austria. The Great Depression of the 1930s brought mass unemployment and desperation across the continent. When democratic governments seemed unable to address economic suffering, people turned to alternatives, to parties that promised action, that projected strength, that offered scapegoats for the crisis. The peace settlement created grievances that democratic governments could not resolve. Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria, the defeated powers, all resented the treaties imposed upon them. Democratic politicians who had signed these treaties or who worked within the international system they created were forever tainted by association with national humiliation. Nationalists who promised to tear up the treaties and restore national greatness found ready audiences. Democratic institutions were often new and weak. Many of the countries that experienced authoritarian takeovers had little or no experience with democracy. The successor states of Austria-Hungary, Czechoslovakia excepted, had no democratic traditions. Germany's Weimar Republic was the country's first experiment with democracy. These new institutions lacked the deep roots that might have helped them weather a crisis. The traditional elites, aristocrats, military officers, industrialists, landowners, often had little commitment to democracy. They tolerated parliamentary government when it served their interests, but turned against it when it threatened their privileges. In Italy, they backed Mussolini against the socialists. In Germany, they backed Hitler against the Republic. In Spain, they backed Franco against the Popular Front. They believed they could use the extremists and then control them. They were usually wrong. The left was divided. Socialists and communists, who together might have formed a majority in many countries, instead fought each other with almost as much passion as they fought the right. The Communist International, following Moscow's orders, denounced Social Democrats as social fascists and refused to form united fronts against the actual fascists. This division was most fatal in Germany, where the combined votes of the Social Democrats and Communists exceeded the Nazi vote in every election through 1932. But the two parties could never cooperate. Violence became normalized. The First World War had accustomed millions of men to killing and being killed. Demobilized soldiers brought their weapons and their attitudes home with them. Political conflicts that might once have been resolved through negotiation were instead settled with fists and clubs and guns. The side that was willing to use more violence often won, and there were the weaknesses of the international order. The League of Nations proved unable to check aggression. When Japan seized Manchuria, the League condemned but did not act. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League imposed sanctions, but not effective. When Germany remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, the League did nothing at all. The lesson was clear. Aggression paid. Dictators who took what they wanted faced no meaningful resistance. By the mid-1930s, the pattern was set. Three major dictatorships, Italy, the Soviet Union, and Japan, had emerged as great powers. Germany, still struggling with the aftermath of the Depression and the restrictions of Versailles, was about to join them under Hitler's leadership. Across Eastern and Southern Europe, authoritarian regimes of various types held power. The democracies that remained were clustered in Western Europe and North America. Britain and France were the leading democratic powers on the continent, but both were weakened by the Depression, divided by internal conflicts, and haunted by memories of the First World War's slaughter. The United States had retreated into isolationism, refusing to join the League of Nations or to commit to European security. The democratic world seemed to be on the defensive, while the dictatorships were dynamic and aggressive. The ideological battle lines of the coming conflict were already visible. Fascism, communism, and liberal democracy represented competing visions of how society should be organized, who should hold power, and what values should guide human life. The fascists glorified the nation, the leader, and the state. The communists proclaimed the revolutionary destiny of the working class. The Democrats defended individual rights, parliamentary government, and the rule of law. These ideologies were not merely different, they were incompatible. Fascism and communism agreed on one thing: liberal democracy was the enemy. The fascists attacked democracy as weak and decadent, incapable of mobilizing national strength. The communists attacked democracy as a bourgeois facade, concealing the rule of capital. Both were prepared to destroy democracy wherever they found it. And yet fascism and communism were also enemies of each other. Fascism was explicitly anti-communist, defining itself against the Bolshevik menace. Communism was explicitly anti-fascist, defining fascism as the last desperate stage of capitalism. The alliance between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia in 1939 would shock the world precisely because it united regimes that had defined themselves as mortal enemies. The democracies caught between these two totalitarian movements struggled to respond. Some advocated firm resistance to fascist aggression. Others hoped that fascism could be appeased, that reasonable concessions would satisfy the dictators and preserve peace. Still others believed that the real enemy was communism and that fascism might be a useful ally against it. This confusion would paralyze the democracies in the crucial years of the late 1930s. The rise of the dictators was not inevitable. At each step, choices were made that might have been made differently. The King of Italy might have authorized resistance to the March on Rome. The Weimar Republic might have suppressed the Nazi Party after the beer hall. The Japanese civilian government might have court-martialed the officers who started the Manchurian Incident. The League of Nations might have imposed effective sanctions on aggressors. These choices were not made, and history took the path it did. By 1936, when German troops marched into the Rhineland in violation of both Versailles and Locarno, the international order created after the First World War was visibly crumbling. The dictators were ascendant, and the democracies were in retreat. The world that emerged from the First World War had been shaped by idealism, Wilson's dream of collective security, self-determination, and a war to end all wars. That idealism had failed. The world of the mid-1930s was shaped by power, raw, unapologetic, unrestrained by law or morality. The dictators believed in power and were willing to use it. The democracies believed in law and were reluctant to use power in its defense. This imbalance would have catastrophic consequences. The dictators would push and probe, testing the limits of democratic resolve. Each time they found those limits to be weak, they would push further. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the dominoes would fall one by one. And when the democracies finally decided to resist, it would be too late to prevent a Second World War. The seeds of that war were planted in the 1920s and early 1930s in the rise of dictatorships that rejected the international order and were prepared to use force to overturn it. Mussolini's March on Rome in 1922 was the first step on a road that led to the invasion of Poland in 1939. Each subsequent step, Stalin's consolidation of power, Japan's seizure of Manchuria, the spread of authoritarianism across Europe, made the catastrophe more likely. The rise of the dictators was a story of democratic failure, but it was also a story of what democracy's enemies got right. at least in the short term. The fascists understood the power of spectacle. Mussolini's march on Rome was as much theater as politics. The black shirts, the Roman salutes, the grandiose rhetoric, all of this created an impression of strength and dynamism that attracted followers and intimidated opponents. Hitler would study Mussolini's methods carefully and apply them with even greater effect. The fascists understood the power of violence. They were willing to kill their opponents, and they were willing to be killed for their cause. This willingness gave them an advantage over democratic politicians who hoped to resolve conflicts through negotiation. Violence worked, at least until it provoked a greater violence in response. The communists understood the power of organization. The Bolshevik Party was a disciplined, hierarchical machine that could mobilize millions of people for collective action. Stalin's control of the party apparatus allowed him to outmaneuver rivals who might have been more popular or more talented. Organization was power. The Japanese militarists understood the power of the fait accompli. By seizing Manchuria without authorization and daring the civilian government to stop them, they demonstrated that those willing to act could override those who merely debated. The international community's failure to reverse its conquest taught the same lesson to aggressors everywhere. All of these lessons would be applied in the years to come. Hitler would combine Mussolini's spectacle with his own genius for propaganda. He would use violence systematically through the SA and later the SS. He would build a party organization that penetrated every aspect of German society. And he would master the fait accompli, moving boldly while his opponents hesitated. The democracies learned their own lessons, but they learned them too slowly. They learned that appeasement did not work, but not until after Munich. They learned that collective security required collective will, but not until after the League had failed. They learned that dictators meant what they said, but not until after millions had died. As we close this episode, standing in the mid-1930s, we can see the outlines of the catastrophe to come. Italy under Mussolini is preparing for imperial adventure. In 1935, Italian forces invaded Ethiopia, fulfilling Mussolini's dream of an African empire. The League of Nations will impose sanctions, but they will be too weak to matter. Ethiopia will fall, and Mussolini will proclaim a new Roman Empire. The Soviet Union under Stalin is in the grip of terror. The Great Purge is about to begin, consuming the party, the army, and the intelligentsia. Millions will be arrested, hundreds of thousands executed, millions more sent to the Gulag. Stalin will emerge from the purge more powerful than ever, but the Soviet military will be devastated, its officer corps decimated. Japan is consolidating its hold on Manchuria and looking for new territories to conquer. In 1937, a clash at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing will escalate into a full-scale war with China. A war that will kill millions and that will eventually merge with the Second World War. And in Germany, Adolf Hitler has been the chancellor since January 1933. He has destroyed the Weimar Republic, established a one-party dictatorship, and begun the persecution of Jews. He is rearming Germany in defiance of Versailles, building the military machine that will conquer most of Europe. He is preparing for the war of conquest he has always intended. The rise of the dictators was not the whole story of the interwar period. Some Democrats resisted, intellectuals who warned, ordinary people who tried to live decent lives in indecent times. But the dictators set the agenda. They shaped events, they made history, and millions would suffer. Understanding how they rose to power is essential to understanding why the Second World War happened. The war was not caused by any single event or any single decision. It was caused by a pattern of choices. Choices made in Rome and Moscow and Tokyo and Berlin. Choices made in London and Paris and Washington. Choices that slowly but inexorably led the world toward catastrophe. The rise of the dictators was the precondition for everything that followed. Without Mussolini, there might have been no Hitler. Without Stalin, there might have been no Nazi-Soviet pact. Without Japanese militarism, there might have been no Pacific War. The dictatorships that emerged in the 1920s and 1930s created the conditions for the conflict that would reshape the world. Next time, we will turn to Germany and examine how Adolf Hitler transformed the Weimar Republic into the Third Reich. We will see how he consolidated power in 1933, how he destroyed his opponents, how he began the persecution of Jews that would lead to the Holocaust, and how he prepared Germany for the war of conquest he had always intended. We will witness the birth of Nazi Germany and the beginning of the road to the Second World War. The dictators had risen. Now, the most dangerous of them all was about to show what dictatorship could truly mean.